inviting ghosts and a family's darkest fear. Summary: 2 women, Mrs. Tam and Mrs. Brown, seek help from a blind spiritual master said to possess great power. They travel to a remote, mist-covered temple deep in the mountains, where the master declares their family is cursed by the year of the tiger. He gives them charms and strict instructions to bury them at 8 points around their house. Back home, strange occurrences begin. Shadows move, objects shift, and whispers echo through empty rooms. The youngest daughter, Lily, first encounters the entity, a tall, shadowy figure in the bathroom, leaving her terrified. Mrs. Brown, obsessed with the master's instructions, returns for further guidance and receives a sealed wooden box, told never to open it. When the box is pried open by her eldest son, chaos erupts. A malevolent spirit, resembling Mrs. Brown's deceased mother, reveals itself, unleashing terror on the household. The family becomes trapped in their own home, haunted and helpless, as the spirits pounding at the doors and windows grows louder until it stops. What remains is an eerie silence more terrifying than the noise, as the family realizes they have welcomed an unstoppable force into their lives. Part 1. The desperate search. The air was heavy, thick with moisture. As the sun began to disappear behind the trees, the engine of the aging Honda motorcycle coughed its last as it rattled to a stop. 2 women, Mrs. Tam and Mrs. Brown, climbed off, both out of place amid the dust and silence of the remote village. Mrs. Tam adjusted her silk scarf nervously while Mrs. Brown checked her handbag for the crumpled note that had led them here. It wasn't their first attempt to find the temple, but it was, perhaps, their last hope. The village was little more than a scattering of wooden houses with roofs darkened from years of rain and decay. It felt abandoned, though faint signs of life emerged, a curtain fluttering, a shadow passing behind a window. Yet no one approached them. "Are we sure this is the place?" Mrs. Brown whispered, her voice tight with unease. Mrs. Tam nodded. "The map said this village. We have to ask someone." They trudged toward a small tea stall, its rickety sign swaying in the breeze. The wood creaked under their shoes as they entered, their presence met by a pair of suspicious eyes peering from behind a newspaper. A woman sat there, middle-aged but weathered beyond her years, the faint glow of a cigarette ember the only sign of life. "Excuse us," Mrs. Tam began politely, forcing a smile. "We're looking for the temple, the one on the mountain." The woman didn't respond at first. Her hand moved slowly, folding down the paper, her eyes dark, calculating, taking in every detail of the women standing before her. Finally, she exhaled a plume of smoke and muttered, "You don't want to go there." Mrs. Brown's fingers gripped the strap of her handbag. "We do. Please, we were told there is someone there who can help us." A master, the stall owner, snorted softly. "Help you? At what cost?" Her voice lingered ominously in the still air. Mrs. Tam's expression grew firm. "That is our concern. Just tell us where to go." The woman's eyes flickered to the window, where a dense wall of forest loomed beyond the edge of the village. For a moment she looked almost sympathetic, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Follow the path," she said at last, nodding toward the overgrown trail that twisted its way up the mountain. 200 steps. A plateau. Then another 100 steps. Mrs. Brown opened her mouth to thank her, but the woman wasn't finished. "It's no place for city women like you. The temple. It isn't what it once was." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Brown's voice quivered. The woman's stare hardened. "You'll see. If you're foolish enough to go." The trail was worse than either woman had expected. It was narrow, almost non-existent, and every step crunched the dead leaves scattered across the forest floor. Above them, the branches twisted together like skeletal fingers, blocking out the remaining daylight. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no rustling, only their labored breaths and the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps. "I hate this place," Mrs. Brown muttered, breaking the quiet. "Keep moving," Mrs. Tam replied. Her tone was calm, but her face betrayed the same unease. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the first set of stone steps. The moss-covered stones rose steeply before them, disappearing into the mist. Mrs. Brown's heart sank. 200 steps, she murmured. That woman wasn't lying. We've come too far to turn back now, Mrs. Tam said, already placing her foot on the first step. The climb was grueling. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself conspired against them. The mist thickened the higher they went, clinging to their skin and clothing like cold, damp hands. The trees seemed to shift in the fog, their twisted forms taking on the shape of gnarled figures watching silently. Mrs. Brown stopped to catch her breath, leaning against a stone. "This is madness," she whispered. "What are we doing here?" Mrs. Tam didn't answer. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed ahead. "Tam." Did you hear that? Mrs. Tam's voice was so soft it was nearly swallowed by the mist. Mrs. Brown froze, every hair on her neck standing on end. She strained to listen, but all she could hear was the faint sound of the wind, carrying something, a whisper. A voice? Then, a low, guttural sound echoed from somewhere above. What was that? Mrs. Brown hissed, her voice breaking. "Keep moving," Mrs. Tam said again, though her voice was trembling now. They pushed forward, every step taking them deeper into the unknown. By the time they reached the plateau, the mist had thickened to a suffocating white blanket. Mrs. Brown gasped when she saw what lay ahead, a second staircase, even steeper than the first, barely visible through the fog. "This can't be real," she whispered. "It's real," Mrs. Tam said grimly. "Come on." As they climbed again, Mrs. Brown couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Shadows loomed just out of sight, shapes that shouldn't have been there. She felt the weight of unseen eyes on her back, the soft shuffle of footsteps that didn't belong to either of them. Finally, they reached the top. The temple appeared through the mist like a ghostly apparition. It was ancient and crumbling, its walls streaked with black moss. The doors were enormous and wooden, bound in rusted metal and covered in faded purple charms that fluttered listlessly. Mrs. Tam hesitated. This is it." Mrs. Brown's mouth went dry. "What kind of place is this?" Before Mrs. Tam could answer, a sound low and unnatural emerged from within the temple. A whisper that seemed to crawl across the air, seeping into their ears. Mrs. Brown turned to flee, but Mrs. Tam grabbed her arm. "We have to go in. We came all this way." The doors creaked open slowly, groaning as though they hadn't moved in years. A wave of cold air swept over them, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Inside, the darkness waited. The women stepped across the threshold, their shoes echoing on the stone floor. The air inside was colder, unnaturally so, and the silence was complete, as if the world outside no longer existed. The temple's interior stretched before them, cloaked in shadows and ancient dust. The faint outlines of statues and altars loomed ahead, their details obscured by the darkness. "Tam, I don't like this place," Mrs. Brown whispered, her voice trembling. "It's fine," Mrs. Tam replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the stillness, a dragging sound, like something heavy scraping across the stone floor. Both women froze. "Did you hear that?" Mrs. Brown breathed. Mrs. Tam didn't respond. Her wide eyes were fixed on the far end of the temple, where something moved in the shadows. A shape emerged, a figure hunched and cloaked, its movements slow and deliberate. A long, gnarled staff scraped the floor as it walked. The women stood rooted to the spot, their fear paralyzing them. Then, the figure spoke. "Why have you come?" Part 2. The Eerie Temple. The forest swallowed them whole as they ascended the crumbling steps. Each step felt heavier, as if the earth itself resisted their presence. The mist thickened with every breath, turning the world into a blur of gray and shadow. Tree limbs twisted above them like grotesque arms clawing at the sky. The silence was deafening. No birds, no insects, only the creak of the women's shoes against moss-covered stone. Mrs. Brown clutched her coat tighter around her trembling form. "This place feels wrong," she whispered, her voice lost in the mist. "We're close," Mrs. Tam replied, though her tone lacked confidence. Her eyes darted nervously, searching the shadows. The fear was palpable now, a suffocating presence that gnawed at their resolve. After what felt like hours, the staircase finally ended. Before them stood the plateau, a desolate clearing where the mist seemed to hang heavier. The forest ended abruptly here, as though even the trees refused to go further. Through the haze, the silhouette of the temple loomed ancient and broken, its walls scarred by time and neglect. "Is this it?" Mrs. Brown's voice trembled. Mrs. Tam nodded, though her face was pale. "It has to be. The temple's doors were immense and foreboding, crafted from wood so old it seemed blackened, held together with rusted metal bands. Purple talismans, their ink faded to near illegibility, hung in uneven rows, fluttering eerily in the still air. A cold wind slid past them, carrying with it the faintest scent of decay. "Should we knock?" Mrs. Brown's voice quivered. She half expected something to answer from within. Mrs. Tam didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch one of the talismans. Before her fingers made contact, the doors groaned, shifting as though they sensed their presence. The women froze, hearts pounding. With a slow, painful creak, the massive doors began to open, revealing an inky blackness beyond. A gust of air poured out, colder than anything they had felt, as though it rose from the belly of the earth itself. "Tam," Mrs. Brown whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "We have to go inside," Mrs. Tam said, though she sounded more as if she were convincing herself. She turned back briefly to her companion. "We came all this way. We can't turn back now." The darkness beyond the door was absolute. As the women stepped inside, their footsteps echoed in the cavernous void. The smell hit them first: mildew, dust, and something more putrid underneath it all, like rotting flesh long forgotten. Mrs. Brown gagged but covered her mouth, unwilling to make a sound. The faint outline of an altar emerged as their eyes adjusted to the gloom. Statues, some half destroyed, sat against the walls. Their faces were twisted into expressions of agony or ecstasy. It was hard to tell. The shadows played tricks, making the figures seem to shift and writhe in the flickering light of the old lanterns hanging from the ceiling. "What is this place?" Mrs. Brown's voice cracked, barely more than a whimper. Mrs. Tam didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the far side of the room, where a small figure sat slumped behind the altar. It was draped in layers of heavy, bright-colored robes, its head bowed low, a staff resting across its knees. "The master," Mrs. Tam whispered, as if afraid to wake him. The figure did not move as they approached, though its presence was undeniable. The air grew colder the closer they got, so cold that Mrs. Brown could see her breath escaping her lips in thin, white tendrils. "Master," Mrs. Tam spoke, her voice trembling. "We have come to seek your help." A long silence stretched between them, so long that Mrs. Brown wondered if the figure was alive at all. Then, slowly, impossibly, the head lifted. The master's face was pale, too pale, almost translucent in the dim light. His eyes were blind, milky white, yet they seemed to look straight through the women. His mouth twitched into what might have been a smile, but the expression was twisted, unnatural. "You came a long way," he rasped. His voice was dry, brittle, like leaves crushed underfoot. Mrs. Brown took a step back, her instinct screaming at her to run, but Mrs. Tam held firm. "We were told you could help us," Mrs. Tam said. "Our family, we've been cursed. Strange things have been happening. Please, we need your guidance." The master's head tilted slightly, as if considering her words. Then he reached into the folds of his robes and pulled out a small, carved object, a wooden charm shaped crudely like a child. Its features were distorted, and something about it made Mrs. Brown's stomach turn. "Take this," the master croaked. He held it out, his hand skeletal and trembling. "This will ward off the worst of it." "But the curse is strong." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Tam asked breathlessly. The master's blank eyes stared ahead, unseeing yet knowing. "The tiger year consumes your family, your husband, your child. They were born under its shadow. Strong-willed, skeptical. It feeds on that disbelief." Mrs. Tam's face fell, but she accepted the charm with shaking hands. "What do we do?" Mrs. Brown whispered. The master did not answer her. Instead, he reached again into his robes, this time producing a stack of talismans, deep violet ink, symbols too intricate to decipher. "Bury these," he said, "at the 8 points of your home. They will hold it at bay." But be warned, the women waited, their hearts pounding in unison. "It will come again." A shiver ran through Mrs. Brown. "What will come?" The master's lips twitched into another broken smile. "The spirit you have invited in at this, The lanterns flickered violently, casting shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. The master let out a breathless wheeze, like a laugh that held no joy. The sound echoed around the room, filling every corner of the temple with its chilling resonance. "Go," he rasped finally, his voice dropping to a whisper. Before it is too late, the women didn't need to be told twice. Mrs. Tam grabbed Mrs. Brown's arm, dragging her back toward the massive doors. The darkness seemed to press in around them, as though it didn't want them to leave. Mrs. Brown stumbled, stealing one last look at the figure slumped behind the altar. The master was still staring, but now he was smiling. And as they burst into the misty air outside, Mrs. Brown could swear she heard the faintest sound behind them: laughter. Part 3. The ritual in doubt. The ride home was silent. The road stretched endlessly before them, the motorcycle rattling over uneven ground. Neither Mrs. Tam nor Mrs. Brown spoke as the events of the temple replayed in their minds. The charm, cold, rough, and unsettling, lay cradled in Mrs. Tam's hands like a fragile burden. The talismans were tucked neatly into Mrs. Brown's bag, but their weight felt immense. By the time they reached the house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised with hues of purple and black. The two women stood for a moment, staring at the house in silence. To Mrs. Brown, it looked different now. The windows darkened like hollow eyes, the shadows under the eaves deeper than they had ever seemed. "We'll start now," Mrs. Tam said finally, breaking the stillness. Her voice was thin, almost reluctant. Mrs. Brown nodded, swallowing hard. "Before it comes the instructions from the master," echoed in their minds. "Bury the talismans at the 8 directions of your home." 8 points like invisible anchors, meant to hold something dark and restless at bay. Armed with shovels and lanterns, the two women began their grim task. The yard was quiet save for the scrape of metal against earth and the occasional whisper of wind. The talismans were simple yet unnerving, the violet ink seeming to glow faintly under the lantern light. Mrs. Brown pressed the first talisman deep into the freshly dug hole at the northern corner of the house, whispering words she did not understand but felt compelled to speak. "Do you think this will work?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Mrs. Tam hesitated, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "It has to." They moved from corner to corner, each placement feeling heavier, as though they were cementing themselves into something beyond their control. By the time the 8th talisman was buried, both women were exhausted, their clothes damp with sweat and dirt smudging their hands and faces. Mrs. Brown leaned heavily on the shovel, breathing hard. "It's done." Mrs. Tam looked toward the house, her gaze lingering on the dark windows. "Let's go inside." The house was warmer than it should have been, as though the walls had absorbed their fear and radiated it back at them. Mrs. Brown's husband, Mr. Brown, was seated in the living room when they entered. The sound of the front door closing startled him, and he looked up with a scowl. "Where the hell have you two been?" he snapped. His voice was rough, irritable, the way it always was when he was disturbed. Mrs. Brown froze, her eyes darting to Mrs. Tam. We were handling something important," Mr. Brown snorted, setting his newspaper down with a loud slap. "Important? You look like you've been digging graves. What nonsense have you gotten yourselves into this time?" "It's not nonsense," Mrs. Brown replied sharply, though her voice wavered. "We're protecting this family." "You wouldn't understand protecting us," Mr. Brown laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "From what? Ghosts? Curses? Have you lost your mind?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Brown snapped, her face flushed with frustration. "I know this much," Mr. Brown retorted, his voice cold. "Every time you listen to this superstitious garbage, you waste our time and money. Running off to temples, burying nonsense in the yard. Do you hear yourself?" Mrs. Tam stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "You may not believe in this, but it's real. We saw things. We heard things. If you don't take this seriously, you'll regret it." Mr. Brown stared at her for a long moment, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're as bad as she is. I'm going to bed. I don't have time for this nonsense." With that, he stormed off, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The house fell silent again, save for the ticking of the clock and the faint whistle of wind pressing against the windows. Mrs. Brown collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "He doesn't understand," she muttered. He doesn't understand what we've done." Mrs. Tam placed a hand on her shoulder. "It doesn't matter. We did what we had to do. Now we wait." That night, the house felt different. The air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Mrs. Brown lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the minutes dragged by. Sleep would not come. Somewhere in the distance, a faint noise like the creak of wood or the soft rustle of fabric snaked its way through the house. She sat up, heart pounding. "Tam," she whispered, but of course Mrs. Tam was asleep in the guest room. Her husband snored lightly beside her, oblivious to the world. "It's nothing," she told herself, clutching the sheets. "Just your imagination," but when the sound came again, a faint, dragging noise, she could no longer dismiss it. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained to hear, her eyes darting toward the door. The noise stopped, and then a single, soft knock echoed from the wall beside her bed. Her body froze. The sound wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, a dull thud like knuckles on wood. "Honey," she whispered, nudging her husband. He stirred but didn't wake. The knock came again, closer this time. Tap. Tap. Mrs. Brown's chest tightened. Slowly, she turned her gaze to the wall. Nothing. Just a faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. She stayed there for what felt like hours, her body rigid, the sound echoing in her ears long after it stopped. In the morning, she said nothing. Mr. Brown sipped his coffee as though nothing had happened, and Mrs. Tam watched her quietly, the dark circles under both their eyes speaking volumes. "Did you hear anything last night?" Mrs. Brown finally asked. Mrs. Tam's face was pale. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "What was it?" Mrs. Tam looked away, her voice barely audible. "Something. Waiting." Part 4. The first encounter. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. The house, cloaked in an unsettling quiet, held its breath as the family went about their usual routines. The youngest daughter, Lily, a girl of 12 with wide, curious eyes, had spent the evening studying alone in her room. Unlike the adults in the house, she was still blissfully unaware of the unease that now draped over their lives like a heavy curtain. Around 10 p.m., Lily pushed back her chair with a small sigh and grabbed her pajamas. Her parents were already in their room, and the rest of the house was dark and silent. She made her way down the dim hallway to the bathroom. Her slippers patted softly against the wooden floor, but each step seemed to echo louder than it should have in the stillness. The bathroom was small but tidy, the tiles cool underfoot as Lily closed the door behind her. The lock clicked softly. She hung her pajamas on the hook and turned on the water, steam quickly clouding the mirror. The faint hum of the pipes was a welcome noise, breaking the silence that felt somehow too thick tonight. Lily splashed her face with water, letting it wash away the day's fatigue. She smiled faintly at her reflection as she grabbed the towel. But when she wiped the mirror clean, her smile faltered. For just a second, a fraction of a moment, she thought she saw something move behind her. She turned around abruptly. Nothing. The bathroom was empty except for her and the steam swirling lazily in the air. She shook her head, scolding herself. "You're imagining things." Silly, with a nervous laugh, she undressed and stepped into the shower. The hot water poured over her, calming her nerves. She stayed there for a long while, letting the warmth soothe her. Eventually, though, the air in the bathroom turned heavy, as though something unseen was pressing down on the room itself. A sharp clink jolted her from her thoughts. Lily's eyes snapped open, and her head whipped toward the shower door. Through the misted glass, she couldn't see clearly, but something felt wrong. She reached for the faucet with trembling fingers, turning the water off. Silence. Except, not quite silence. There was a faint sound, barely audible, a soft, deliberate breathing. Lily froze, every muscle in her body tensed. Someone's here, her heart pounded as she stared at the glass. The breathing grew louder, slow, ragged, as though it came from something just beyond the door. Lily wiped a small hole in the steam with her hand, peering out. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, in the fogged mirror above the sink, was a shadow, tall, gaunt, and motionless. Its outline was distorted, like it didn't quite belong to this world. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she watched the figure's head slowly tilt toward the mirror, as though it knew she was looking. No, no, no. No, the figure did not have a face, just a smooth black void where its features should have been. Lily wanted to scream, to move, to run, but her body betrayed her. Her legs refused to listen, and her voice died in her throat. The figure began to move, its shape shifting in the mirror like smoke. And then tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the bathroom door. Knocking. Slow. Insistent. Lily's eyes darted to the door, her chest heaving. "Mom," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. No answer. The knocking stopped, and for a moment she thought it was over. But when she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The faintest whisper slithered through the air, a sound that wasn't quite words but felt like someone breathing her name. Lily, the door handle rattled. That was enough. Lily screamed, a high-pitched, blood-curdling sound that pierced the stillness of the house. She bolted out of the shower, slipping on the wet tiles and crashing to the floor. The pain barely registered as she scrambled for the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. She yanked it open and burst into the hallway, dripping wet and shaking violently. The house was alive with noise now. Footsteps thundered toward her, and she barely registered her mother's voice. Lily. What happened? Mrs. Brown appeared at the end of the hallway, panic etched into her features. Lily collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, the bathroom door still swinging open behind her. It was there, she gasped. In the mirror. I saw it. I heard it. Mrs. Brown held her tightly, smoothing her damp hair. Shh. It's okay, you're okay, but her voice was shaking too, betraying the fear she was trying to hide. Mrs. Tam appeared moments later, her face pale. She glanced toward the bathroom, where steam still drifted out like ghostly tendrils. What did she see? Mrs. Tam whispered. Mrs. Brown didn't answer. Instead, she stared into the dark bathroom, her arms still wrapped around her trembling daughter. The silence that followed was broken only by Lily's sobs and the faint creak of the door as it slowly swung shut. Later that night, Mrs. Brown sat at the edge of Lily's bed, watching her daughter finally drift to sleep. She brushed a damp strand of hair from Lily's face, her hand trembling. Mrs. Tam sat in the chair across the room, her voice low. It started. Mrs. Brown turned to look at her, her face pale and drawn. What do we do? Mrs. Tam didn't answer immediately. Her eyes lingered on the window, where the night seemed darker than ever before. We wait, she said finally, her voice a whisper. And we pray it doesn't come back, but in her heart, Mrs. Brown knew it was already too late. Part 5. Escalating Hauntings. The morning after Lily's terrifying encounter, the house was heavy with silence. No one spoke of what had happened in the bathroom, but the unease lingered like a bad taste. Lily refused to be alone, shadowing her mother wherever she went. Mrs. Brown tried to dismiss the fear in her daughter's eyes, but the truth gnawed at her. She had seen the terror in Lily's face. It was real. By the afternoon, strange things began to happen. It started subtly. The light bulbs flickered when Mrs. Brown moved through the rooms. The clocks in the house stuttered, their ticking uneven and erratic. The kitchen faucet dripped steadily no matter how tightly it was turned, each drop echoing louder and louder. Then the whispers started. At first they were faint, like wind slipping through cracks in the walls. Mrs. Brown dismissed it, telling herself it was just her imagination. But that explanation crumbled when she heard it clearly for the first time. While folding clothes in the laundry room, a voice low and drawn out brushed against her ear. Brown. She dropped the shirt she was holding and spun around, her breath ragged. No one was there. The laundry room door was shut. Her hands trembled as she gathered the clothes, but the voice returned closer this time. Brown. Let me in. Mrs. Brown stumbled out of the room, leaving the laundry behind. She pressed her back against the hallway wall, her chest heaving as she tried to steady herself. But the whispers followed her. No matter where she went, they lingered in the corners of her mind, insidious and relentless. That evening, the air in the house felt wrong. It was as though the walls themselves had drawn closer, pressing inward, trapping them. The family sat in the living room together, a thin veil of normalcy attempting to cover the growing unease. Mr. Brown, predictably, scoffed at his wife's nervous glances. The lights flickered. The faucet dripped. "You're grasping at ghosts, woman," he muttered, turning back to the evening news. "Something is happening here," Mrs. Brown whispered fiercely, her voice trembling. "You didn't see what happened to Lily." "You didn't hear what I heard. I heard her screaming last night," Mr. Brown replied without looking up. "A nightmare. Nothing more." Mrs. Brown opened her mouth to argue, but the room was plunged into darkness. The television snapped off, the hum of electricity silenced. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mr. Brown let out a frustrated growl. "Great." "The breaker again." "Wait," Mrs. Tam said quietly, her voice cutting through the dark. Listen, a sound echoed through the house, a soft, rhythmic thud coming from above. It was distant, deliberate, like footsteps treading carefully across the upper floor. Lily whimpered, clutching her mother's arm. "Mom, what is that?" Mrs. Brown didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the ceiling, her heart pounding. The footsteps continued slow and heavy, as though something was moving just above their heads. "There's someone upstairs," Mr. Brown muttered, his earlier bravado crumbling. He grabbed a flashlight and rose to his feet. "I'm checking." "No," Mrs. Brown cried, grabbing his arm. "Don't go up there." "It's probably nothing," he said, shaking her off. "The roof, it's just settling." He moved toward the stairs, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. Each step creaked under his weight. The sound of his ascent echoed through the house, mingling with the faint tapping from above. Mrs. Brown clutched Lily tightly, her eyes never leaving the staircase. The footsteps upstairs stopped the moment Mr. Brown reached the landing. "See? Nothing," his voice called out, muffled and shaky. The family waited, holding their breath. Then came the crash. A deafening slam shook the house, followed by the sound of something skittering rapid, animalistic across the floor above. The flashlight beam jerked wildly as Mr. Brown's footsteps thundered back down the stairs. He burst into the living room, his face pale. "I don't know what that was," he gasped, "but there's no one up there. I told you," Mrs. Brown whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "There's something in this house." By midnight, Mrs. Brown had reached her breaking point. She couldn't stay in the house another night without doing something. She grabbed her coat and keys, ignoring Mr. Brown's protests. "Where the hell are you going at this hour?" he barked. "To the temple," she snapped. "To see the master. He has to help us." The journey to the temple was even more harrowing this time. The forest was pitch black, the mist even thicker than before. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and every shadow twisted into something monstrous. When Mrs. Brown finally arrived, the temple loomed ahead like a dark sentinel, its broken walls barely visible through the fog. The doors creaked open before she could knock. The master sat in the same place as before, his blind, milky eyes fixed on nothing yet somehow piercing through her. "You return," he rasped, as though he had been expecting her. Mrs. Brown fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please, it's getting worse. My daughter saw it. We hear things, footsteps, whispers. You have to help us." The master was silent for a long time. Finally, he reached beneath his robes and produced a small, sealed wooden box. Its surface was etched with symbols that seemed to shift under the flickering candlelight. "Take this," he said, his voice low and heavy. "Place it on your family altar. Do not open it. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see." Mrs. Brown hesitated, staring at the box. It felt wrong, cold and heavy, like a prison. What is inside?" she whispered. The master's expression darkened, his milky eyes seeming to bore into her soul. "A boundary," he said cryptically. And a warning. Mrs. Brown clutched the box tightly, her hands trembling. She didn't understand what he meant, but she dared not question him further. "Go," the master said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "and pray that you are strong enough to keep it closed." Part 6. The boxes opened. The wooden box sat atop the family altar for days, a silent sentinel watching over the house. Its presence made Mrs. Brown uneasy. She could feel something emanating from it, a strange coldness that seemed to seep into the air around it. She had followed the master's instructions precisely. The box was placed in the exact center of the altar, surrounded by unlit candles. And as he warned, she did not touch it again. But the house felt worse. The footsteps returned each night, louder now, heavier. The whispers had multiplied, coming from every corner, every hallway, at all hours of the day. Objects shifted when no one was looking. A chair moved a foot across the dining room floor. Picture frames hung crooked, and Lily's toys were found in strange places, lined up neatly at the bottom of the stairs or stacked in unsettling patterns. And the cold. The cold was relentless. Even with the heaters running full blast, it felt like winter had crept inside their walls, biting at their fingers and toes. The breaking point came one afternoon when Lily's older brother, James, returned home early from school. A teenager of 16, James was brash, skeptical, and dismissive of the growing unease in the house. "It's just a box," he scoffed when Lily timidly mentioned it to him. She had been staring at the altar that morning, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. "Mom says we're not supposed to touch it," she whispered. James rolled his eyes. "That's because Mom's going crazy. You think some stupid old box is going to save us from ghosts?" Please, that was the moment James decided to prove everyone wrong. The house was quiet when he climbed the stairs to the altar room later that day. The room was dim, the thick curtains drawn shut. Dust motes floated lazily in the slivers of light that broke through. James hesitated only briefly as he approached the altar, the box sitting innocently among the faded relics of their ancestors. "It's just a box," he muttered to himself, but his voice was quieter now. As he reached out, his fingers tingled, the air around the box unnaturally cold. He hesitated. Then, with a burst of defiance, he grabbed the box and wrenched it open. For a split second, nothing happened. James peered inside, frowning. What the hell is this? Nestled inside the box was a small wooden doll. Its surface was cracked and weathered, its limbs uneven and crudely carved. The worst part was its face, two round indentations for eyes, painted a deep, blood red that seemed to glisten in the faint light. Its mouth, though barely etched, twisted into a mockery of a smile. James felt a shiver crawl up his spine. "Creepy little thing," he muttered, lifting it out of the box. The wood felt heavier than it should have, unnaturally cold, like it had been buried in ice. That was when he heard it. A low, groaning creak came from the floorboards beneath him. James froze, the doll still clutched in his hand. The sound stretched, growing louder, as if something massive was stirring deep within the house. And then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the hallway just outside the room. "Lily," James called, his voice cracking. There was no response. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the sound vibrating through the walls. The air turned frigid, and the light dimmed as though the house itself were holding its breath. James's eyes darted to the door, his heart hammering. Bang! The door shook violently, the wood rattling in its frame. James staggered back, nearly dropping the doll. The footsteps stopped. Silence. James's breath came in short, ragged gasps. He glanced back at the doll in his hand. Its red eyes seemed to glimmer now, as though it were watching him. The smile, too, looked sharper, hungrier. "What is this?" he whispered hoarsely. Before he could move, the door burst open with a deafening crash. A freezing wind howled into the room, extinguishing the last of the light. James cried out as the temperature plummeted, his breath misting in the air. And then he saw it. A shadow moved into the doorway, a tall, gaunt figure with limbs too long, its shape fractured like smoke struggling to hold form. It stood there, silent, its presence drowning the room in dread. The red eyes of the doll pulsed in James's hands, matching the rhythm of his pounding heart. The figure took a step forward, and the floor groaned beneath it. Its head tilted, as though studying him. James' voice whispered faintly. It sounded like Lily, but wrong. Twisted. James stumbled back, the doll slipping from his fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. The figure stepped closer, its face a shifting void, blacker than the shadows around it. It reached out with long, claw-like fingers, and the temperature dropped even further. James's knees buckled as the cold pressed down on his chest, making it impossible to breathe. James, the scream came from downstairs. Mrs. Brown. The spell broke. James staggered to his feet and ran, nearly tripping over himself as he fled the room. The hallway was darker than before, the shadows closing in on him as he bolted for the stairs. Behind him, he heard the faint sound of laughter, low, hollow, and cruel. Mrs. Brown caught her son as he stumbled into the living room, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "What happened? What did you do?" she cried, shaking him. The box, James gasped, clutching at her. "I opened the box." Mrs. Brown's heart dropped. She looked up toward the staircase, where the shadows seemed darker now, stretching toward the living room like reaching hands. The temperature in the house had plummeted. Her breath misted before her lips. What did you see?" Mrs. Tam asked quietly, stepping forward. James shuddered, his eyes wide and glassy. Something was there. "It's awake now." As if to confirm his words, a soft creak sounded from upstairs. The footsteps began again, slow and heavy, echoing down the walls of the house. They were no longer alone. Part 7. The Spirit revealed. The footsteps never stopped. They moved through the house with dreadful precision, slow, heavy, deliberate. From the creaking floors above, they spread into the walls, the hallways, the very bones of the building. No corner of the house felt untouched. No room was safe. Mrs. Brown sat huddled with James and Lily in the living room. The lights flickered sporadically, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. A candle sat on the coffee table, its flame swaying wildly, as though disturbed by an unseen force. "Mom, it's cold," Lily whispered, trembling beneath the blanket. Mrs. Brown pulled her daughter closer, but the chill was beyond her power to ward off. Her breath misted in front of her face. James sat across the room, staring blankly at the floor, his hands trembling. He hadn't spoken since opening the box. The doll, that awful, blood-eyed doll, was back in the box now, sealed shut. But it didn't matter. Whatever it had unleashed was already here. "We need to leave," Mrs. Brown said suddenly, her voice breaking the tense silence. "And go where?" Mrs. Tam asked from the doorway, her face pale. "It's not the house, it's us. We've invited it." In the words hung heavy in the air. Invited it, and the sound of footsteps ceased. The silence was so abrupt, so absolute, it made Mrs. Brown's ears ring. She turned toward the stairs, instinctively clutching Lily tighter. Then she heard it. A whisper, low and guttural, seeping through the cracks in the walls, slithering around the room like smoke. At first, the words were indistinct, like the murmur of a crowd, but then it spoke clearly, directly. "Why did you bring me here?" The voice sent a shiver through Mrs. Brown's body, freezing her in place. It was familiar, achingly familiar. She looked up slowly toward the base of the staircase. A figure stood there, cloaked in shadow. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its outline flickering like a candle flame. For a moment, Mrs. Brown thought her eyes were deceiving her, that the figure was just another trick of the light. But then it stepped forward. The shadows seemed to pull back, revealing a face that made Mrs. Brown's breath catch in her throat. It was her mother. No, not her mother. A distortion. A nightmare version of the woman she had loved. Her mother's face was pale and sunken, her eyes hollow and rimmed in black, the irises gleaming red like hot coals. Her mouth hung open in an unnatural grin, her lips cracked and bleeding. Strands of gray hair hung limply over her face, and her body was shrouded in a tattered dress that swayed though there was no breeze. "Mom," Mrs. Brown whispered, her voice trembling. The spirit tilted its head sharply, as if hearing something amusing. Its grin widened. "You brought me here?" It hissed, its voice layered a broken harmony of whispers and shrieks. "Why? Why?" The candles in the room snuffed out in an instant, plunging them into darkness. Lily screamed as a freezing gust tore through the house, knocking over furniture and rattling the windows. The figure's laughter rang out, echoing off the walls, growing louder and more distorted with every second. Mrs. Brown grabbed Lily, yanking her to her feet. "Run." The family bolted from the living room. James stumbled behind them, his legs weak, as they careened into the hallway. The footsteps returned, but now they were thunderous, pounding up the walls, down the hall, beneath the floors. The house groaned and shook as though something massive was crawling through its very foundation. "To the door," Mrs. Brown cried, pulling at the front door handle. It wouldn't budge. The doorknob was ice cold, freezing to the touch, and no matter how hard she yanked, it held firm. Behind her, the spirit's voice whispered again, closer this time. "You let me in. You brought me back." A low creaking sound came from the hallway. Slowly, Mrs. Brown turned her head. The figure was there, standing at the other end of the hall, motionless. Its face was clearer now, lit by the faint glow of the flickering hallway light. The eyes, those burning, hollow eyes, stared straight at her. And then it moved. The spirit lunged forward, its footsteps slamming against the floor, its form twisting and contorting as it advanced. The air filled with a scream, Lily's, Mrs. Brown's, James's, a chorus of terror that mingled with the spirit's laughter. James grabbed a chair and hurled it at the figure, but it passed through the spirit like smoke. It didn't slow down. "Get upstairs," Mrs. Tam shouted, shoving Mrs. Brown toward the staircase. The family scrambled up the stairs, tripping and stumbling in their haste. Behind them, the spirit's footsteps were relentless, echoing with a monstrous rhythm. As they reached the second floor, the hallway lights exploded one by one, glass shattering and plunging them into near total darkness. "The box," James shouted suddenly, his voice hoarse. "The master," he said. "The box, what about it?" Mrs. Brown gasped, pulling Lily into a bedroom and slamming the door behind her. The lock clicked, but the pounding footsteps stopped outside the door, so loud the walls trembled. Maybe if we put it back," James cried, his voice breaking. "Maybe it'll stop." Mrs. Tam's face was pale in the darkness. "It's not enough anymore. We shouldn't have opened it." "What do we do then?" Mrs. Brown whispered, clutching Lily against her chest. Her daughter's small body was trembling violently, her sobs muffled against her mother's shoulder. The spirit's voice returned, muffled through the door, its tone mocking, angry. "Why did you forget me? Why did you leave me? You brought me back. And now you can't send me away." The doorknob rattled violently, and then silence. The family froze, their breaths shallow. They stared at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But nothing came. Mrs. Brown dared to inch forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. The moment her skin made contact, the entire door slammed inward, knocking her off her feet. Cold, rotting air swept into the room, and the figure stepped through the threshold, towering, twisted, grinning. "You let me in." The lights exploded, and the house plunged into darkness as the family screamed. The spirit did not stop. It kept coming, its broken laughter filling every corner of the house, unstoppable, eternal, and vengeful. Part 8. Trapped in terror. The family fled deeper into the house, their frantic footsteps echoing against the walls. Mrs. Brown carried Lily tightly against her chest, the girl's sobs muffled against her shoulder. James followed close behind, his face pale and damp with sweat, his breathing erratic. Mrs. Tam brought up the rear, her head whipping around every few steps as though she could feel the spirit breathing down their necks. The house was alive with noise. The walls shook violently as if something immense was trying to claw its way inside them. Doors rattled and slammed shut of their own accord. Windows shuddered and groaned as though about to splinter. And then, louder than everything else, came the pounding. Boom. Boom, the sound came from everywhere at once, the doors, the windows, the very walls. It was relentless, deafening, as though a dozen fists were hammering to be let in. The family reached the living room, collapsing into a terrified heap. Mrs. Brown slammed the door behind them and threw her weight against it, her heart pounding as hard as the spirit's fists. "It's trying to get in," James cried, backing up until he hit the far wall. "It's already here," Mrs. Tam said softly, her voice nearly drowned out by the cacophony. Her gaze darted to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. "It doesn't need a door." The pounding intensified. With every thud, the wall seemed to bend inward, the plaster cracking. Lily wailed, covering her ears, her small body trembling violently. "Stop it," Mrs. Brown shouted, her voice cracking. "Stop it," but the spirit didn't listen. The pounding continued, louder, heavier, until the walls themselves seemed to scream under the pressure. And then, Slowly it began. The whispers. They slithered into the room like icy tendrils, crawling into the ears and minds of everyone present. The voices layered over one another, overlapping, twisting into something indecipherable yet cruelly intimate. Mrs. Brown squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. You left me. You forgot me. Why didn't you come back? You let me in. Mrs. Brown's head throbbed, her mind unable to contain the voices pressing in from all directions. Lily screamed again, curling into a ball on the floor, her hands clamped over her ears. James staggered forward, his knees buckling as he clutched at his temples. Make it stop, he cried, his voice cracking with panic. Please, make it stop, Mrs. Tam, her hands trembling, crawled toward Lily. She pulled the girl into her arms, whispering words that were meant to comfort, but her voice was drowned out by the noise. Her face was ashen, her eyes darting toward the walls as though expecting them to burst apart at any moment. Then, without warning, the room went deathly still. The pounding stopped. The whispers cut off mid-sentence, as though someone had snapped their fingers and silenced them. The sudden quiet was worse than the noise. It pressed against their eardrums like a physical weight, suffocating and unnatural. What happened? James whispered hoarsely, his hands still shaking. Mrs. Brown didn't dare answer. She looked around the room, her heart still racing. The house had fallen into a dreadful calm. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker now, darker, pulsing faintly like something alive. It stopped, Mrs. Tam said slowly, though her voice was edged with caution. But why? The question hung in the air. For a moment nobody moved, nobody breathed. Mrs. Brown glanced at Lily, who had gone quiet, her wide eyes staring at something behind her. Lily, Mrs. Brown whispered, turning her head slowly. The living room window was no longer shrouded in curtains. At some point during the chaos, the fabric had been pulled back, revealing the blackness beyond. And there, on the other side of the glass, stood the spirit. It was watching them. The figure's face was pressed against the window pane, its red eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Its mouth hung open in that grotesque grin, its lips moving silently as though speaking words no one could hear. Its hands, thin, elongated, clawed, rested against the glass, the tips of its fingers tapping lightly. Tap, tap, tap. Mrs. Brown's entire body went rigid. The spirit tilted its head, its mouth stretching wider, impossibly wide, as though it were amused. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised one hand and pointed directly at Lily. No, Mrs. Brown whispered, clutching her daughter tightly. No, leave her alone. The spirit's tapping stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, it laughed. The sound was muffled by the glass, but it echoed inside their heads, a broken, rattling cackle that seemed to scrape against the walls of their minds. The light in the room dimmed further. The shadows on the floor began to stretch and move, creeping toward the family like ink spreading across paper. It's coming back, Mrs. Tam said sharply, her voice shaking. It's not done with us. The light bulb above them flickered violently, sputtering like a candle about to die. The tapping resumed, louder this time. The glass creaked, splintering as cracks began to spread outward from where the spirit's fingers touched. We have to do something, James shouted, his voice breaking. We can't just sit here. Mrs. Tam turned to him, her face stricken. The box. We need the box. Mrs. Brown's eyes widened. It's still upstairs. James pushed himself to his feet, his legs wobbling. I'll go. No, Mrs. Brown said sharply, grabbing his arm. You can't go alone. Before anyone could argue further, the window shattered. Shards of glass rained into the room, slicing through the air like tiny daggers. The wind roared into the house, ice cold and unnatural, carrying with it a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from every direction at once. The spirit stepped through the broken window. It moved like smoke, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it slid into the room. The red glow of its eyes cast faint, flickering shadows on the walls. Its mouth moved silently, its grin now stretching from ear to ear. Mrs. Brown screamed. Go, Mrs. Tam shrieked at James, shoving him toward the door. Get the box. James didn't hesitate. He bolted from the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the pounding wind. Mrs. Tam grabbed Lily, dragging her toward the far corner of the room as the spirit advanced. Mrs. Brown staggered to her feet, her hands trembling as she faced the figure head-on. "Leave us alone," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't mean to bring you here." The spirit stopped, its head tilted sharply, its grin freezing in place. And then it spoke. "But you did." Its voice echoed through the room, hollow and endless. The spirit raised one clawed hand, and the shadows surged forward, pulling Mrs. Brown off her feet. She screamed as they wrapped around her arms and legs, dragging her toward the center of the room. "Mom!" Lily screamed, reaching out for her. James's footsteps pounded back into the room. He was holding the box, clutching it so tightly his knuckles were white. "What do I do?" he cried, his voice desperate. Part 9. The Unstoppable Force. James stood in the doorway, clutching the wooden box tightly as though it were the last shred of hope keeping the family alive. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and sweat beaded on his brow. Mrs. Brown writhed on the living room floor, tangled in the dark shadows that slithered like serpents across her limbs. Lily screamed for her mother, reaching toward her with tiny, trembling hands, but Mrs. Tam held her back, tears streaming down her own face. "What do I do?" James shouted again, his voice cracking as the spirit's glowing eyes turned toward him. The spirit, that twisted, grotesque echo of Mrs. Brown's mother, stood motionless, its body half solid, half smoke. It loomed over Mrs. Brown, as though savoring her suffering, its head tilting unnaturally to watch James with those gleaming red eyes. Slowly it raised one hand, pointing a clawed finger directly at the box. "It wants the box," Mrs. Tam whispered hoarsely, still clutching Lily protectively against her chest. "Then I'll give it the box," James cried. "No," Mrs. Tam screamed, her voice sharp enough to pierce the chaos. "It's not the box it wants, it's us. The box is a boundary. If you let it go, there will be nothing to stop it." James froze, the truth of her words hitting him like a physical blow. He looked down at the box, the wooden surface etched with those faint, shifting symbols. It seemed to hum faintly in his hands, vibrating with some unseen energy. But the spirit had already begun to move. It stepped toward James, its feet, if they could be called feet, barely touching the floor. The shadows moved with it, curling outward like a wave, blotting out the flickering candlelight. James stumbled back, his grip on the box tightening. "You brought me here," the spirit said, its voice a low guttural hiss. "You opened the door. You let me We didn't mean to," James shouted, backing further away. "We didn't know." The spirit's grin widened impossibly, its hollow mouth stretching from ear to ear. "And now you will pay." The shadows surged forward. James turned on his heel and ran, bolting toward the stairs. The shadows slammed into the walls behind him, splintering wood and shattering picture frames. Lily's scream echoed up after him as he sprinted to the second floor, every step rattling beneath his feet. James, Mrs. Brown's desperate voice called after him. But he couldn't stop. "I have to protect this box," he thought. "I have to keep it safe." The second floor was no better. The hallway lights flickered violently, plunging sections of the corridor into darkness. The walls bulged unnaturally, the wallpaper tearing in places as dark hands seemed to push through the surface, reaching for him. James darted into the first room he could find, his own bedroom, and slammed the door behind him. Boom. 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 The pounding returned, this time directly on the door. James collapsed against it, his chest heaving, the box still clutched tightly in his arms. He could feel its energy now, a strange warmth that spread into his fingers, almost as if the box was alive. "What do I do?" he whispered, tears streaking his face. "What do I do?" The pounding stopped. The sudden silence pressed against his ears, and James's breath caught in his throat. He looked down at the box, its surface still humming faintly, and for a moment he thought he heard something, a voice, faint and distant, coming from inside it. James's head snapped up. He looked toward the window, where the curtains hung still, the glass frosted over from the unnatural cold. And then he heard it again. "James, let me out." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent chills down his spine. It was not the voice of the spirit, it was something else entirely. Something older. Something deeper. He looked down at the box, his hands trembling. "No," he whispered. "No, I won't." The box pulsed violently in his hands, and the voice turned sharp, angry. "You opened the door. You let us in. You cannot stop us." Suddenly, the door exploded inward, and James was thrown across the room. The spirit entered, its shadow filling the entire space. It moved toward him with horrifying speed, the red glow of its eyes locking onto the box. "Give it to me," the spirit hissed. "No," James screamed, pulling the box to his chest. The spirit lunged, its clawed hands outstretched. James scrambled backward, his back hitting the far wall. He shut his eyes tight, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Help me," he sobbed. "Someone, please, downstairs." Mrs. Brown fought against the shadows, still holding her down. Her body ached with bruises where the tendrils squeezed too tightly, and her vision blurred from exhaustion and fear. Across the room, Mrs. Tam whispered prayers under her breath, clutching Lily protectively. "Where is James?" Mrs. Brown croaked, her voice barely a whisper. The spirit's laughter filled the house, vibrating through the floorboards. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a symphony of terror that shook the very foundation of the house. The walls began to crack, dark veins spreading outward as though the house itself were decaying. "It won't stop," Mrs. Tam said suddenly, her voice flat. "It's unstoppable now. There has to be a way," Mrs. Brown cried, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Tam shook her head slowly. "We let it in. There's no sending it back." Mrs. Brown collapsed onto the floor, sobbing helplessly. She could hear James screaming upstairs, his voice mixing with the spirit's guttural howls. Lily cried softly in Mrs. Tam's arms, her small body shivering uncontrollably. And then slowly the house began to fall silent again. The laughter faded. The pounding stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the family's breathing. Then the voice returned, soft and cruel, whispered directly into Mrs. Brown's ear. "You are mine now." The living room lights flickered once more before going out completely, plunging the house into darkness. A single final scream echoed through the halls, a scream that was cut off abruptly. Days later, the house stood silent. No lights shone from its windows. No voices called from inside. The neighbors whispered of strange shadows seen moving behind the curtains, and some claimed they still heard faint pounding in the dead of night. But no one dared approach. Inside the house, the wooden box sat untouched in the center of the living room. Its surface was cold and still. In the corner, a faint shadow lingered, its shape vaguely human, watching, waiting. The family was gone. No one would ever find them. And the spirit remained. It always remained. Because once invited in, it could never be banished. The end.